And finally, we will acknowledge that energy policy is not just a vital element of U.S. economic policy, but it's also a vital element of U.S. foreign policy.
More evidence for the president. A dozen Russian military intelligence officers indicted.
Expect the Deputy Attorney General to walk out here just any minute now. Here he comes. But, you know, obviously the timing here with the president overseas is very, very unusual. So
if I listen long enough to you.
According to the allegations in the indictment, the defendants worked for 2 units of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, known as the GRU.
And just a few days before he meets with Russian President Vladimir.
Now, the indictment does not allege crimes by any Americans, nor that the conspiracy altered the vote count or changed any election result. However,
like any patriotic American, I was absolutely appalled by the press conference that capped off the president's trip to Europe this morning.
That people who have a lot of support and love for this country, who have said that there is no question that Vladimir Putin and the Russians interfered in American elections, if they just saw what we all saw, that it shouldn't take very long for them to release a statement.
We don't need to ask Putin about it. The evidence is ironclad. We know what the Russians did, and now it's spelled out again in excruciating detail.
But I can tell you, on the facts, the United States was attacked, and President Trump today sided with the enemy.
The timing of this, from my perspective, on the eve of this potentially historic summit with Putin and the president in Helsinki, the Deputy Attorney General, working with Robert Mueller, releases all this damning information about Russia's alleged interference in the U.S. presidential election. What do you make of the timing of this?
Intervening in the elections, I think we already knew that. This is now a heck of a lot more evidence of exactly what took place and obviously who was involved. And so I think we've now reached a point where there's no question what happened. And the fact that the President of the United States seems to continue to ignore that a foreign adversary deliberately, with specially trained agents, tried to interrupt one of our elections and is planning to meet with President Putin in 2 days, that should be alarming. That meeting needs to be canceled.
This indictment, what did you learn today that was new to you?
Well, I think I learned some of the details, but I don't think I learned a lot new. As I said, in the intelligence community assessments, we already had, most of the essence of the nature of the attack and who was involved. 2017, when the intelligence community issued the assessment, it identified the GRU, that's the Russian General Staff, the Russian military intelligence, as being the perpetrators.
Our country is under attack. Literally, that attack is ongoing and pervasive, verified by objective and verifiable evidence.
His own Justice Department has put out overwhelming evidence of what happened, and he needs to represent what's best for our country and our republic.
The White House is underlining the fact that these indictments do not mention or or indict any Americans. There's no conclusion in here that anybody in the Trump campaign or affiliated with the Trump campaign or any American at all knowingly spoke.
We let Americans know that the proof is unequivocal.
He can stand up for the truth and condemn what we all know Putin did instead of siding with Russia.
The president can show the evidence to Vladimir Putin. The president can demand that Vladimir Putin never do this again. The president can demand that Vladimir Putin extradite intelligence officials, something he's unlikely to do.
No, Putin is not right. Trump is wrong. We believe our institutions. We trust in our democracy. Russia did interfere. We will not trade facts for feelings of legitimacy. We will not trade our conscience for conspiracies. No.
Continuing act of war by Vladimir Putin, and he will stop at nothing to destroy these Western democracies.
Fundamental truth. Russia attacked our democracy. We won't stand for it. We won't let the president say otherwise.
On Friday, the U.S. government made the most significant case to date that Russia's attack came from the top of Putin's army. Those are the charges in the indictment. Now, whether Donald Trump and his allies were part of that conspiracy does remain an open question. Prejudging that outcome is not fair or constructive or how our rule of law works. So we don't prejudge the outcome of that probe, but
this is evidence of collusion. Not collusion in the initial attack, which you talked about we don't have a clear picture on, but it's collusion from the very beginning in the cover-up.
Rod Rosenstein and Bob Mueller handed President Trump the evidence that President Putin had requested.
Extraordinary set of indictments this week, right? Where the United States said it was prepared to prove beyond a reasonable doubt with public evidence to a jury that President Putin is lying about his denials with respect to the election interference, and that we have absolute proof of this. And yet the response from the White House is a political response, as opposed to, as Tori is pointing out, I think exactly.
The shocking amount of forensic evidence, the detail that actually places the proverbial gun in the hand of Vladimir Putin in the undermining of American democracy.
We are in a 9/11 national emergency.
Trump's eagerness to sell out America proves the Russians must have something, personally, politically, or financially, on President Trump. Yesterday, the president sided with the enemy.
Constantly refers to an investigation that's already yielded 35 indictments as a witch hunt. And all I have to say is that the hunters are finding a lot of witches, and a lot of them are connected to Donald Trump. Is at the heart of this was a conspiracy, which is laid out in this indictment. Crimes were committed by officers of Russian intelligence that was done at the direction of Vladimir Putin, as our intelligence community has discerned.
The president would ever deliver the talking points of the Kremlin.
He and Putin seem to be speaking from the same script. The only European nation that's actually seized territory from another since the end of World War II. There's only one country that's at least partly responsible, according to G7 ministers, for shooting down a commercial airliner. But somehow, both countries are responsible.
They're also doing things like the terrible attack, the nerve agent attack in Great Britain. They're supporting a Syrian dictator who is using chemical weapons on his own people to kill even children. And it's just on and on and on.
Putin's actions, they're pretty outrageous. Annexing Crimea, intervening in Syria to prop up a brutal dictator, interfering in our elections, and by the way, poisoning British citizens.
In 2014, in violation of international law, Russia invaded neighboring Ukraine and annexed the Crimea region. Russia has assassinated political opponents abroad, most recently through the use of poison in Salisbury, England, on a former spy and his daughter, a chemical attack that endangered the lives of many, many civilians.
Shooting down the Malaysian airliner MH17, to murdering people in the UK, to cyber interference in the U.S. democracy, to his murderous assault in Syria. He's just excusing all that.
To it. It's not just the interference. The list of things, which is why this meeting shouldn't happen tomorrow, the list of things, Margaret, Crimea, Ukraine, the shoot-down of MH17 killing 298 people, the use of nerve agents in the United Kingdom, aiding and abetting war crimes in Syria, the list of actively hostile actions by the Russians since Putin's return to office is extreme, and we haven't had any response from the president on this. This is really his responsibility now.
Remember, Putin is the man who supports Bashar al-Assad's bloody regime, who annexed Crimea, who is meddling in Ukraine, who has been blamed for a chemical weapons attack on British soil. This is the man President Trump says he trusts over his own intelligence people.
U.S. President of the United States standing next to any leader, let alone one that has attacked the country, that has attacked the elections process, that is responsible for war crimes across the Middle East, the annexation of his neighboring states, and his attempts to weaken liberal democracy all across the world.
He and Putin seem to be speaking from the same script, as the president made a conscious choice to defend a tyrant against the fair questions of a free press.
We must continue to focus on how we get our gas here in the United States, our natural gas, to Europe, to our allies, so they're not so dependent on Russia.
Use our massive shale gas resources to begin shipping liquefied natural gas overseas.
He took a KGB officer, a known liar's word for it,
His actions toward Mr. Putin may reflect that concern in terms of what is in Donald Trump's past that the Russians have and might use against him.
Is there anything you can characterize for us that perhaps Russia might have on Donald Trump?
I'm not going to go into that at all.
But it does exist.
No, I'm not saying it exists at all. I'm just saying that Trump knows.